This is the third and final seminar from our series, which turned out to be a spring seminar, Pre-Modern Digital Humanities. And it's a nice way to wrap up. We have here today with us Laura Morreale and Sean Gilsdorf. Laura is an independent scholar and historian whose research addresses medieval Italy, the Mediterranean world, and medieval French outside of France. She has chaired the Medieval Academy of America's Committee on Digital Humanities and is currently serving as editor-in-chief of the journal Digital Medievalist. And Sean is a lecturer on medieval studies at Harvard University. His research addresses the intellectual, religious, and political history of the early and high Middle Ages, focusing upon post-Carolingian Western and Central Europe, as well as the political and cultural history of the medieval Caucasus. They have collaborated before. If you're not familiar, they edited a volume, Digital Medieval Studies, Practice and Preservation, in 2022. And this volume highlighted the ways digital methods are expanding and redefining how we understand, represent, and teach the Middle Ages. Today, they will enlighten us. They will share insight that they gained while they were co-editing the forthcoming volume, Digital Medieval Studies, Experimentation, and Innovation. So I will mute myself now. So Laura and Sean, please take it away.
Thanks so much. And it's so wonderful to see so many friends in the audience. Thanks so much for taking time in your day. And for that, I'm going to start our presentation today with a little pop quiz that I hope that you all will just participate in to get us going. So the question for you all, for the audience, was, what was the first humanities website on the internet? I'm going to give you a second to answer in the chat if you can do that. And we'll see if anyone has the answer to that. We have any responses there? I don't know if I can see no, I can't see the chat. All right, I'll put you out of your misery. The answer is The Labyrinth, which many of us know, that appeared in about 1993. Now, the 1993 launch of The Labyrinth represents the starting point of medieval studies on the internet, the topic that we're going to be talking about today. This groundbreaking digital project has its own backstory, of course, that dates back to March of 1992, when Georgetown medievalist Deborah Everhart wrote an excited letter to a friend about how she might connect the work of medieval scholars using the new network technologies, including the nascent World Wide Web. I couldn't stop thinking about the networking we were discussing, she wrote. Professors of literature might be a key target. The time is right now, she gushed. In her letter, Everhart went on to describe quite prophetically what this network might include. That is, online journals, works in progress forums, conference listings, job listings, literature, image, and music servers, on and on. Her vision for an interconnected locus for medieval studies would, as we know, be called the Labyrinth. And it was not only the first website in our field, but the first ever humanities-based website as well. In our time today, we're going to reflect on what has happened since the 1993 launch of The Labyrinth. And I want to thank Maria Blaskovich and Simone Ventura especially for the invitation to present our retrospective on the first, and I would say foundational 3 decades in digital medieval studies. Now, my colleague Sean and I hope to open a broad discussion about what has been accomplished in digital medieval studies so far, and on what has arguably become one of the most widespread means that we as medievalists currently examine the medieval past. But I'm going to pass the screen to Sean now, who's gonna start us off.
Thanks. So as Lauren mentioned, and as Maria said as well, our talk today draws from this new book, Digital Medieval Studies, Experimentation and Innovation, which is the second in a series that's been published by Humanities Press, and we hope to have further volumes coming out in the future. And the essays in this book are meant as a challenge, or perhaps a challenge to, or perhaps a reevaluation of recent approaches to the so-called digital humanities and to the development within the interdiscipline of medieval studies. Next slide. Most medievalists today, I think, are familiar with the figure of Roberto Bussa, It's him. The Italian scholar of medieval philosophy who, starting in 1946, harnessed the new technology of electronic computing to create a machine-readable text and comprehensive index of the works of Thomas Aquinas. Interestingly, of course, this early digital project was originally published in hard copy form in 49 volumes, the Index Thomisticus, but now is available online. And you can see the homepage right there. Next slide. Buce's project now is generally identified as foundational for the field not only of, quote, digital medieval studies, but of humanities computing or digital humanities more generally. It was the first in a series of databases, editions, and other projects that capitalized on the data compilation and manipulation that were enabled by computer technology. These are two examples, Christine Klapper-Zuber and David Herlihy's work on the Florentine Catasto is probably the best known of these sort of early efforts that created a huge database of the Florentine Catasto. Next slide. So as Laura and I began planning the first volume in our series, though, we realized that digital medieval studies today, when we talk about it, it's defined not simply by computers and computing, but instead, and I think more emphatically, by computers in conversation, a phenomenon made possible by the creation of the World Wide Web in the 1970s and its elaboration into the ubiquitous meta-communication network that we now know simply as the Internet over the course of the 1990s and beyond. And as Laura mentioned before, this point for us was driven home by the opening essay in that first volume, where Deborah Everhart and Martin Irvine chronicled the creation and growth of the Labyrinth, which debuted in 1993, and which was the very first web-based resource of its kind, not just in our field, but in the humanities as a whole. Next page. So Everhart and Irvine's account emphasized the Internet's profound impact upon scholarly work in our field. And in fact, while the most senior members of our profession, present company included, began their careers in the pre-internet age, many more have grown up teaching and researching with web-based resources. The newest generation of medievalists, born years after the Labyrinth appeared, can't remember a time when immediate worldwide communication and information access weren't the norm. At the same time, computer and web-based initiatives, like the ones seen here, frequently continued to be seen as distinct from, quote, real research. One reason for this is inertia, because institutions as well as individuals either have avoided or been unable to evaluate those initiatives on their own terms or to integrate them within older analog systems of knowledge exchange, despite the obvious value they bring and the obvious talent of the people who create them. Digital medieval studies, in other words, tends not to be recognized as the field-changing enterprise it is, because the very way it operates challenges long-standing and deeply ingrained, yet demonstrably wrong, assumptions within the academy. Next slide. So a major goal of our new book is to push back against these misconceptions by representing digital medieval studies as essential to medieval studies and a critical mode of inquiry. Also, and I think this is very important for the book's, what the book is trying to do, it's something with a history that's worth telling and worth understanding. Despite its contested status, digital medieval studies has proven to be a site of tremendous innovation and scholarly productivity, informed by questions, approaches, and values from, quote, so-called traditional scholarship, while also offering new ways to practice it. This diversity is exemplified by the initiatives that are chronicled in the book. Next slide. We're going to begin, therefore, with an account of what innovation looks like in digital medieval studies, which Laura will be doing, before we turn our attention to the three fundamental characteristics of the field that distinguish digital medieval studies from other medieval research. The first of these is the central role of pedagogy in many digital projects, both in terms of the needs and concerns that spur their creation, the audiences they envision, and the forms that the projects themselves take. The second is the emphatically collaborative, team-based nature of digital medieval scholarship, which we've called here partnerships, a characteristic engendered by the unique mix of intellectual and technical expertise required to create a digital oeuvre. The last of these characteristics, and one both generative of and resulting from the other two, is the professional and material precarity faced by digital humanities practitioners, including the people who made Buce's pioneering work possible, most of whom are not members of the full-time professoriate, operate in limited-term positions, and rely upon tenuous and rarely long-term sources of funding. They are, in Julia Nyhan's memorable phrase, invisibilized workers. Final slide. As we're going to see, all of these three characteristics are, as the saying goes, features, not bugs, of the DMS enterprise, underpinning its utility for our scholarly community, but also contributing to its frequent marginalization. And this is a situation best expressed by the Latin motto estimabilis, sed non aestimatum, valuable but not valued. So I'm now going to hand over the podium, as it were, to Laura to talk a bit about the question of innovation within digital medieval studies.
Thanks, Sean. Now, despite how valuable, yet often how little valued these projects are, our book recognizes that the work done in the first 3 decades of the internet-based digital medieval studies has changed the field in ways we may even have ceased to recognize, precisely because they are now so commonplace. Once more, in looking at digital medieval studies projects and approaches from these last 30 years, we became aware of how deeply rooted these approaches were and are in the scholarly activities we all practice and value. And while we all understand in our own ways what we mean by scholarship and what such undertakings entail, it's more difficult to isolate what it means for something to be innovative, and more specifically, how the process of innovation has played out in digital medieval studies. The projects profiled in our book have made clear that scholarly innovation in digital medieval studies has historically occurred in 2 particular ways. First, opportunistically, as a flash, a response to a specific need, whether pedagogical, research-based, or both. And secondly, rather incrementally, as a slow burn, an accumulation of specific needs and responses over time that eventually lead to a way of doing things that differs from what has come before. Now, whether this is a model for how change happens generally is a conversation for a different time, but it's certainly what we have seen with this small sampling of medieval DH projects. But let's look to a few examples to illustrate what we mean. A great example of a project combining the creative flash with a slow, innovative burn is the Medieval Review, or the TMR. As co-authors Deborah Delianis and James O'Donnell explain in their chapter, the idea for the Medieval Review, the world's first open access humanities e-journal, came out of one specific desire to solve a problem, namely how to speed up the process of reviewing newly published books in medieval studies. Inspired by one conversation between O'Donnell and his co-creator Richard Hamilton, TMR founders decided to publish jointly created overviews of medieval studies books on a listserv delivered to subscribers via email instead of in print only, a completely novel format for the early 1990s. Despite some initial misgivings on the part of readers concerning the validity of an online journal, TMR became a wildly successful undertaking, as the creators soon realized that delivering reviews digitally was helpful not only for dissemination, but also for soliciting reviews from readers and managing the publication process from start to finish. Moreover, a growing awareness of the long-term accumulated benefits of the digital medium, accompanied by shifts in technology compatible with them, encouraged TMR leadership to move from an email-only delivery system to a permanent web-based presence, where reviews were published and are now carefully archived for the long term. It was thus by addressing the singular problem of how to deliver reviews reliably and expediently, combined with a recognition of the multiple benefits of this approach over time, that allowed TMR to publish over 4,000 reviews of medieval scholarship over the past 30 years. A second example of an inventive digital project that grew out of a singular research question is Mapping Gothic France, a project that examines the Gothic architecture, one of the most well-recognized and well-studied cultural products of the Middle Ages. Although project directors Stephen Murray, Andrew Tallon, and later Stefan von Lieferinger had long contemplated the meaning of the term Gothic, they were frustrated by how its complexity was flattened by traditional representations of the style when transferred to the printed page. This flattening of space, they argued, led to similarly two-dimensional explanations of the style in its genesis, as well as the rationales offered up for its longevity. Now, Murray and his collaborators turned to digital tools to solve this problem, hoping that by digitally capturing three-dimensional qualities of these iconic buildings, they might answer important questions about the meaning of the Gothic architectural form. Aside from their immediate success in representing Gothic buildings in 3 rather than 2 dimensions, project leaders soon discovered that the computer's ability to simulate the holistic nature of an in-person experience and to access multiple sites simultaneously allowed them to make scholarly comparisons that other media simply could not replicate. Mapping Gothic France was so successful in its many digital recreations that a new program was established at Murray's home institution, Columbia University's Media Center for Art History. Now, what these and several examples suggest is that innovations in early digital medieval studies relied heavily upon seeking answers to very specific research questions. Sorry. By using digital methods, coupled with the ability to remain open to the long-term benefits that searching for answers in this way might yield. Research questions, however, arise from a variety of scholarly activities, and the decisions to go digital often means accepting the drawbacks that come with this kind of approach. And I'll pass this back to Sean.
Yeah. So as we said, what we'd like to talk about now is these 3 areas that we've identified as sort of hallmarks of digital scholarship and the things that both enable it and also challenge it. And the first of these is pedagogy. And because teaching is often viewed as far less prestigious than individual research, the pedagogical origins of many digital projects may prevent colleagues from recognizing their intellectual bona fides. Outward-facing, open access, pedagogically oriented digital projects tend to be under or devalued as scholarly work in their own right. And I wanted to focus right now on the Images of Medieval Art and Architecture site, which was pioneered at the University of Pittsburgh by Alison Stones and Jane Vadnal, and then preserved and profiled by Alison Langmead, it's an excellent example of a widely used digital resource for learning about the Middle Ages, whose groundbreaking intellectual roots remain far too little understood or acknowledged. Next slide. This should bring back memories for some of us. The inspiration for the 1994 launch of Medieval Art and Architecture was a series of seminars that Alison Stones attended in the late 1960s and early 1970s about how machines might come to the aid of teachers by enabling more student-driven interactions with materials and allowing instructors to tailor the coursework to students' own experiences with technology. Stone's first experiments in this vein involved an automated tape slide system, that's what we see here, that combined a pre-recorded lecture with a mechanized slide deck, thereby allowing students to hear and view the lesson at their own pace. The taped lectures with accompanying slides were paired with workbooks and a written project guide to facilitate the students' independent study. Next slide. Stone's graduate student, Jane Badnall, saw the potential of combining the art historical materials that Stones was collecting for her tape slide machines with the capabilities of the nascent internet, which, as we remember, in 1993-94, the very first interactive browsers had just been released. I think it was Netscape. In yet another experimental step, Vadnal and Stones migrated Stone's original materials to the web and continued to adapt to and help define the technological and publication norms that the new medium required. Medieval Art and Architecture, the website that they produced, introduced further interactive options into the site's interface, such as embedded student quizzes and learning exercises. Stones and Vadnal, however, didn't just create a teaching site that eventually would be used by instructors and researchers worldwide. They also carried out a decades-long experiment to confirm their hypotheses about the importance of visual learning within the discipline of art history. Next slide. Classroom demands were equally critical for the creation of Dan Klein's groundbreaking Electronic Canterbury Tales project, which came about 5 years later. Klein's work began with an effort to collect and curate materials already on the web for immediate use in the classroom. These were tailored to the kind of students that Klein was teaching at the University of Alaska Anchorage and the interests he knew they already had. The range of material that Klein decided to include in Electronic Canterbury Tales was wider than that found on other online Chaucer resources, including one at Harvard University, encompassing sites and sources that were far more popular in their orientation. Next slide. This approach rang true with his students, so he soon added his own teaching materials, including syllabi, class notes, and peer-reviewed articles, to supplement the web resources he'd gathered earlier. Klein also began to document the site itself, not just so he could share his experience in using digital tools with other interested scholars, but also to introduce the notion of standardized documentation in a medium that still had few guardrails. Klein's early acknowledgement that the environment in which he was operating was largely unstructured and unregulated, and his willingness to push its boundaries underscores his dedication to experimentation in the name of serving his students, and also his awareness of what he needed to do to make this possible. Next slide. In addition to the learning-based goals that many projects share, the collaborative nature of computer-based initiatives also may contribute to their devaluation and often their dismissal as scholarship. The old myth of the heroic scholar is still a powerful one in our profession. It wrongly suggests that the best scholarly work is accomplished by a solitary genius who, through native brilliance and staunch perseverance, produces the canonical truths of the disciplines. But recent DH scholars have rejected the notion that any scholar, whether they're writing a monograph or working on a computer-based initiative, truly works alone. But because digital scholarship is so often collaborative, and the partnerships needed to create it are front and center, we often consider them less impressive than work that was ostensibly produced by a single scholar author. Our own book, of course, is meant to challenge this misperception, and you only need to look at the table of contents to see this, which indicates how important team-based approaches are to digital medieval studies. If you look at the table of contents, you'll see that almost all of the chapters are actually co-authored, and the volume itself, of course, is also co-authored and co-edited, and the series is also co-edited by Laura and myself. So in a sense, the book is itself a testimony to the collaborative nature, the partnerships nature of digital medieval studies. Next slide. And this collaborative quality is particularly evident in a project that Laura's already alluded to or talked about, which is the Medieval Review, which was the first open access humanities e-journal, which is rather remarkable. The Medieval Review's original impetus came not from the vision of a single scholar, but rather from a conversation among colleagues about how to reduce the time needed to solicit, produce, and disseminate reviews. Acknowledging that the review process already relies on a collaborative working relationship between book reviewers and editors, the original iteration of TMR produced jointly created overviews of medieval studies books on a listserv delivered to subscribers on email. And over 30 years, TMR has dispatched reviews reliably and expediently, depending on a team made up not just of scholars, but of digital librarians, technology experts, as well as a rotating roster of editorial board members who are all volunteers, all of whom ensure the journal's steady publication, even as systems of production, delivery, and workflow have changed dramatically over the same time. Next slide. Past TMR reviews, which now number over 4,000, which again is a remarkable number, remain open for anyone to read and have been archived for long-term reference and citation. And you can see here, this is the archive pages of the Medieval Review today, where you can go back to 1993 and read the original reviews. It clearly has accomplished even more than might be expected from a traditional review journal, expanding the purview of medieval studies through collaborative working models that in turn build communities of interested readers and learners. So in short, despite how fundamentally at odds most digital medieval studies projects are with long-standing academic assumptions about scholarship, the Medieval Review and the other initiatives discussed in our volume have changed the field dramatically, creating an environment for research and learning upon which medievalists in every discipline now rely. And now to the third leg of our three-legged stool, the question of resources or the lack thereof.
So now, however impressive these advances may be that Sean's just outlined, they were not made without significant risks to their creators. And we've identified three types of precarity common among early digital medieval studies projects that illustrate these risks. Financial, technological, and affective precarity were and continue to be almost ever present, endangering the kind of discoveries such work so often produces. And I'll turn to a few examples now to illustrate what we mean. Financial precarity is not uncommon to digital medieval studies and remains a big part of the story of the well-known Internet Medieval Sourcebook, a website that so many of us know, right, that houses textual sources from the Middle Ages and that is used by millions of people every year, either in the classroom or for general reference. This project, as profiled by Sourcebook creator Paul Halsell and Fordham Center for Medieval Studies webmaster Professor Marianne Kovalevsky, was launched in the mid-1990s and quickly became the go-to for instructors wishing to provide a no-cost alternative to the medieval source readers of previous eras. Despite the success of this project, which at one point counted over 11 million visitors annually, despite this success, few realize that this long-standing digital medieval studies project has always relied principally upon the unpaid labor of its creator to keep it functioning and expanding. Even though the sourcebook has received institutional tech and hosting support over all these years, a choice was made early on to keep the website and all of its pages free from commercial patronage, primarily because the project's directors believed that accepting payment would undercut the resource's status as a purely scholarly endeavor, and in turn curtail its use. Thus, the sourcebook and its creator, for the sourcebook and its creators, financial precarity was not solely the result of extended underfunding, which of course happens in many other projects, but also seemingly a prerequisite for the project's ongoing success. But financial precarity is not the only threat facing digital medieval studies. In 1997, Digital Scriptorium, a member-supported consortium of American libraries and museums, launched a freely accessible online database of pre-modern manuscripts that were housed in the collections of its members' institutions. This valuable and groundbreaking resource featured a database that allowed users to cross-institutionally search through detailed manuscript descriptions that were accompanied by a sampling of high-resolution images. Truly, and I think we can all go back to that point, this was truly an amazing feat for the final years of the 20th century, and it was spearheaded brilliantly by the four folks we see on the left here, Consuelo Dutschke, Charles Faulhaber, Barbara Shaler, and Bill Stoneman. However, as technologies changed over time, the burden of maintaining the original database became too high for many of the member institutions, and the antiquated information management system became too cumbersome to function effectively. The project only survived due to a recent overhaul of the cataloging system by the DS 2.0 consortium, led by manuscript specialists Deborah Cashin and Lynn Ransom that you see on the right here, and with the help of an advisory board of experts. Without the large-scale intervention of DS 2.0, funded by a substantial grant, this foundational manuscript cataloging tool would have ceased to function, and the work of its original founders would have been lost. Although the swift pace of technological change requires those who create projects to remain up to date on the state of the field, not responding to shifts in the technology or user environments means that many valuable projects will ultimately disappear. Finally, a third type of precarity in digital medieval studies concerns the kinds of emotional risks of producing materials about the medieval past that do not conform neatly to the traditional and therefore more prestigious forms of scholarship. For example, in his early efforts to create an online space for new research about the Middle Ages, medievalist.net creator Peter Kaczynski invested not only his imagination and hard work, but also a great deal of emotional capital in order to swim against the prevailing academic tide. He reports that while he was planning his groundbreaking digital undertaking, a site that has since been visited 83 million times since its founding in late 2007, he was well aware that, in his words, quote, running a website was almost considered a black mark for anyone hoping to have a career in academia, end quote. While confronting the challenges of making a living from publishing innovative ideas and cutting-edge research about the Middle Ages for public consumption, Peter and his co-creators, Sandra Alvarez and Daniel Sobilski, had to bear the emotional toll of wondering whether they were being taken seriously by the very same academics whose work they were chronicling. This was a kind of effective precarity that other digital medievalists have also had to endure. Now, by recognizing these three types of precarity, we see how tenuous the status of digital medieval studies is and has been over the course of its short history. One reason we included pictures of our contributing authors, all of whom were involved in the projects they profiled, was to underscore the very human element in the history of digital medieval studies, and to emphasize that where we are today is the result of choices made by a gathering of scholars, like we see here, in response to both the lightning bolt of inspiration and to the slow burn of accumulated decisions, all in the context of the many forms of precarity they managed to overcome, but which might have dismantled what online medieval studies was ultimately able to achieve. But we're going to stop our presentation here and open up the floor to questions, to comments, or to reflections on what we have put forth, or perhaps even to gather some input from you all, from your own experiences with digital medieval studies over these last foundational decades. Thanks.
Okay, I would just like to thank you in the name of everybody before everybody starts clapping digitally. Thank you for the lovely presentation, for a very insightful overview, for such powerful metaphors. I think we're all familiar with the slow burning, but also with the thunder when it hits us, and also for addressing some of the aspects that need to be discussed more and that we probably have all experienced, if not on a daily basis, then every now and then. I am not sure if people would just like to join in and ask questions spontaneously, or if you want to use the chat and type them, that is fine with us. There's still some people coming in, so I will focus on that and on the chat, if you don't mind. Monica Green, yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Monica.
Good morning or afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much. I have been watching all of this happen for the last 30, 40 years, and I still learn so much from the presentation today. So thank you. And I look forward to the book. I have a sense that the presentation you made is North America focused. And I was wondering if you could talk more about, once we add in other parts of the world, are there ways in which there are national characters to the digitization projects? So, just to take the most obvious example, certain countries in Europe have thousands more manuscripts to digitize than North America does. And they're also, and this is not a national project in the US, where it has been national projects in Britain, in France, and other places as well. So I'm just wondering to just make it more global, and in terms of how that affects funding as well. Thank you.
Laura, you want me to?
Go for it.
I mean, a few things I would observe. One, I do think it's interesting that a lot of these foundational. I've been thinking a little bit about this very question about where things happen and when. That some of these foundational projects did happen in the U.S. and Canada, and I've often wondered whether it isn't because it's not a national project, perhaps. That medieval studies in the United States has always been a sort of we're kind of poaching on somebody else's stuff. I also think there is a lot to be said for the fact that there was so much digital innovation happening in the U.S. In early days. So a lot of people were doing this kind of work in other fields. But although I had somebody say that to me, said, "Oh, well, so digital medieval studies just sort of piggybacked on the work being done in the humanities and by modernists." And I said, "Well, that's absolutely completely it's reversed. Medievalists were doing it first, and then a lot of modernists picked it up. So that actually doesn't correlate." In terms of national characters, I do think that the last article in the book is by Stephen Nichols, which is a really interesting retrospective on his own sort of the role he played, and he I think undersells a very important role he played in the digitization of the manuscripts of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And one of the things that comes out of his telling is the interesting mix of or perceived resistance to digital technology as something to use in manuscript studies on his part, not on many other people's part. And then what he actually discovered was when it was explained to people how open they were to it, how quickly it happened. And I'm not sure exactly what to do with that. And I think your point is an interesting one too, that when you have a lot of something, it can be very, very daunting. It's a lot easier to digitize your collection of 40 manuscripts than it is to digitize your collection of 40,000 manuscripts. And people, I think, more willing to take on the small project first. And so that, I think that would explain perhaps some of the differences between the projects we see. Although I don't think I would want to talk about national character projects now, because digital medieval studies and digital humanities in general is so ubiquitous, at least within the European and North American academia. And there would be more to be said. One of the projects that Laura and I are thinking about, sorry, Laura, for a future volume of this is thinking, in fact, about the global turn in medieval studies and how how digital medieval studies is working outside of the European North American continuum, because there's a lot of really fascinating projects that are now being done, particularly in Africa and Asia.
And I would just add,
thank you so much.
yeah, and I would just add to that, Monica, thank you so much for bringing that up, because I think there is a difference between digitization and digital medieval studies, at least in my mind, right? I mean, I think digitization is obviously takes a lot of work and, you know, has its own requirements in terms of metadata and in terms of information scientists paying attention to that. But I think, you know, it's slightly different from manipulating the materials that we now, you know, have digitally, have access to digitally, and sort of creating a sort of an analytical frame for what we study. So it's true that I think the European folks in particular, you know, already have to start off with that whole process of digitization, right? Whereas we can tend to sort of play with what we have already. But thanks.
Thank you both so much.
Amelia? Just unmute yourself.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I loved your presentation, and it really resonates very deeply with me, especially in two areas, which are innovation and precarity. I do identify with that. Let me explain who I am. I never thought I would be involved with the digital humanities, because you can see from my face and my hair that I'm a bit older than you. However, I am Portuguese by birth. I worked very many years at the University of Georgia, and I'm a medievalist of the heart, even though I was not able to teach in that area, but I continued researching. And is another thing. One thing is important: to digitize documents, study them. But from my point of view, being a linguist and a philologist, it is important to translate them also to other languages, so that they will be fully accessible and understandable to the wider community. So in about 2010, I put together a program to translate this set of 3 Portuguese chronicles that cover the transition from the end of the 14th to the 15th century. Extremely important, a treasure trove of information, detailed information of all layers of society and all aspects of medieval life, but because they were in medieval Portuguese, inaccessible to the majority of the scholars. So what I did, I got together a team of people to work with me, and we applied for funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and they were extremely enlightened, very, very helpful. And the other thing that they did, that at the time I thought it was troublesome, and I realize now what a blessing it was, is that for them to give us the funds to make this translation into English, we had to create a website. And we could have done anything, but I decided, if I'm going to go through the trouble, I'm going to do a proper website, and it's going to be useful. And since we were working with 6 translators in 2 continents and 4 different countries and several universities, it was invaluable in order to define our glossary, in order to define the spelling of the various characters in these chronicles, because you find Portuguese, Castilians, Navarrese, English, French. And normally when these chronicles were edited, even by Portuguese editors, nobody troubled to see who were these people? Where do they come from? And for a non-Portuguese reader, would be very confusing to know who are they. You know, the names are all written in the same way. So we decided that each one of them would have the spelling of the modern language of the country or the area where they come from. Well, that needs to be on a database. So we decided to start creating a database with the names of these people. Well, having done that, now we need to define who are they. And we began to give a few lines, found externally or from the text explaining who they were. And then we decided, well, we need to know the places because whoever is reading will want to go to a map and see where they are. We started putting those, making a list of those places as well. And also created a glossary because many terms, depending on the context, may be translated in different ways. So we ended up also with the glossary. We had one problem because I was the only medievalist in European studies that existed in the University of Georgia. And so all my work was done from Georgia, but collaborating with people in the United Kingdom and in Portugal. So we were crossing the ocean, other than the personal commitment that we had to do this translation and to do the best work that we had, and also the umbrella of the funding of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and also another major Portuguese funding institution, and then others came in as well. We worked on it. The work took us about 12 years to be made. The book came out yesterday, The Chronicles of Fernão Lopes, in 5 volumes. And also, because we have got digital means, we were able to elaborate an index, a detailed index for all 3 chronicles that are in 4 volumes in order to make the work easier for the reader or the scholar. At the time, people were saying, or even the NEH said, why don't you do it just online? Well, this is another problem because we are still in this process of evolution. As you were saying, the work online was not as valuable and technology is changing all the time. We decided, no, we want a printed edition to make sure this work is not lost and will be in libraries, but we will carry on developing the website. So in the end, we found out that the website is really working as a sort of interactive footnotes that can be supporting any edition of these chronicles that you read. It doesn't matter in what language. We also discovered that they are being useful, for instance, for students, in different universities. One of our colleagues at University of Leeds, Iona McCleary, she teaches introduction to the Middle Ages, and she likes to use extracts from these chronicles. Now the students have got extra information that they can use. But the greatest discovery that we have made very recently is that the secondary school, there are a couple of secondary school teachers in Portuguese high schools that are using our website in order to support their students because Fernão Lopes is part of the national program in literature and history at high school level. And we found, well, that is a very good step. And at the moment, we are going through an overhaul of our website, and we want to invite some of those teachers as well, because we feel that medieval studies is extremely important. Usually, the medievalist has got a background that covers a whole area of activities and capabilities, but also the students from a young age need to appreciate the value that there is in it and to be involved in it, and especially in a country, in Portugal, which is considered one of the oldest, if not the oldest country, in Europe with a history. Now we are a very small country, but in the old days interacted with many of the so-called larger countries such as France and England at the period, and Castile during the period of the 100 Years' War. And that is what we want to do, and is to cultivate and encourage a larger group of students from a young age, and therefore by doing that also, as the generations progress, create a new appreciation of the work that is involved, and also an effort to preserve all the documents that we have. And in that regard, if you go to the website of the Institute of Medieval Studies, you will see that my colleagues, who are historians, I'm a philologist, have done an absolutely wonderful, wonderful work. I'm speaking of my experience, but I know that all of you in the United States, because I go regularly to Kalamazoo, and various other colleagues in different points, of the world, are doing a fantastic job. And I'm so glad that you do this presentation. Sorry for taking your time, but I had to share.
Well, thanks so much for that perspective. I mean, certainly from the non-US perspective, that's very helpful. And I think that you brought up a really great point about the fact that we're learning at this point about what the digital can do for us. And I think that your point about publishing something both in print and then using the digital for what it does best is a great demonstration of what we have in fact learned over these past 30 years. And that it's not just either digital or print, but rather how these two formats can work together. So thanks so much for that.
Thank you.
And I would add too, I think that to expand on that, I think it was interesting that you have NEH grant, or you have grant giving institutions who sort of betrayed a certain vision of what digital work is, in the sense that it's cheap, or it's the easy out. Like, no, you don't have to publish a book, just keep a digital version. A website's fine. Which I think both underplays the synergy between so-called traditional scholarship and digital scholarship, but it also, I think, undervalues, as you said, the kind of work and effort that goes into creating digital products in the first place. You were engaged in a decade-plus endeavor to get all this online, and just be told like, oh, that's fine. We don't really want to do anything. You've done all the work for us. We don't do anymore. I think it's an interesting. It speaks to a different kind of precarity, I would suppose, which is a paucity of imagination.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Amelia, from us too, for the Fresh Out of the Oven publication. The next question will come from Fiona McGuire.
Hello, I'm Fiona McGuire. I'm a medieval Hispanist, or more accurately, a long-standing digital medieval Hispanist who has worked in both North America and England, in a European and non-English language. Thank you for your fascinating presentation, and I look forward to reading your book. It's very important, I think, to document the history of digital humanities, and in particular the medieval aspect, because we were pioneers. And although I don't like to call myself that, I realize from the perspective of history that you are covering that I am also one of them. I went as a postgraduate to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the late 1980s, where a medieval Hispanic project on 15th century, a very large corpus of Hispanic poetry collections, manuscript and early printing, was being led by a professor there who had an NEH grant. And medieval Hispanism certainly cut its teeth in North America, with Madison, a very important center for the Old Spanish Dictionary project, adopting digital methods. So I would like to recognize the important pioneering contribution of North American scholars. You've alluded to some of them, but certainly in the Hispanic field, and particularly with Madison and with Faulhaber in Berkeley. I then came back to England, where certainly the American model of funding and technological advance was behind, definitely, in the late 80s. And since then, there's been important catching up. So I would say that now it is much more global in terms of how we apply these technologies. But your perspective on history is accurate, that the origins probably are North American, and then developing more in European field and in globally as well. I can tick many of the boxes of the issues that you've raised, including financial, where one is always. I worked on a project which is still continuing at the University of Liverpool. We had the national equivalent of the NEH, the HRC funding, and then other pockets of funding, and also the our goodwill, continuing to work with no funding, the precarity of contracts on fixed term contracts, etc., etc. And I also worked on a medieval historical chronicle at the University of Birmingham in England. So I two big projects. And all of the issues that you raised, the financial, the funding, getting further funding is an issue. The technological is affecting us on the Spanish poetry project, which is a long-term one going back in its origins to Illinois in the late 80s. And I would stress from the technological aspect of the problems, two key aspects, at least of my experience. One is formats. It's very important to use standard formats, and this may be the norm now, but it wasn't in the past. The fact that we used ASCII and latterly TI has meant that we can still reusability of all of the work in file formats is very important to stress. Because some of them become redundant because the technology has moved on and the format is either commercial or is now just a fossil and can't be read. So that is a very important point, to use standardized formats that can still be reused decades later. But also the emphasis on websites. Websites have a sell-by date. Everybody emphasizes websites. But what we've hit is a serious reef, and Maria Moras in Barcelona knows this well, that our 15th century large corpus of Spanish poetry is unavailable because of the format of the interface software, which is a security problem. So I think there's an over-reliance on websites and their durability. And I think what we need to emphasize now, which hasn't been touched on, is the importance of data sets and encouraging scholars to interact with the data sets that have been generated. And the advent of technology to read digitized manuscripts, such as Transcribus, automated transcription, is going to accelerate the generation of data sets for scholars. And this is where I think this leads to your important emphasis on pedagogy, because instead of a top-down approach with big funded projects, which are important and excellent, at the same time, I think a bottom-up approach where students from the beginning learn digital literacy using these data sets is a way to integrate the digital model more into medieval studies generally. And lastly, so finally, on this last point, this session coincides with an online session and in person at the University of London. I've been dipping into it and then wanted to hear this one. But they are talking precisely about the problems of the attack on the humanities in general as a discipline, and the way that digital literacy is being used to support or to advance the argument that that humanities still has a role as a discipline in the modern world going forward. And so digital literacy, writing and culture programs are being developed for students And presumably that will be where data sets that are hopefully deposited in the right format in university repositories or in public digital repositories can take the discipline forward that you have so admirably chronicled the history of. So thank you very much. And I look forward to reading your book.
Well, thank you so much for those comments, and thank you for being, a pioneer and taking the risks that we know that you had to take in order to do that work. I'm just going to say one quick point on the data sets point, because this is a project that another project that I'm undertaking, and that happens to be a series with digital philology, trying to, just as you say, find a venue to publish data sets that, everyone has a data set on his or her own laptop, just living there. And the point of the series is to publish those data sets, put them in an online repository, but then also to engage two user reviewers of that data set, not only to find a place to publish these things, but also to model how we as scholars should be or can, in fact, reuse the work that, people have taken years to put together, right? And so it's not only a question of, can we publish it? It's like, how do we know how to use it, and how do we know how to value it, right? And so I think that's a next step for us. And I think that your points about getting into the most durable file format for your files, right? Steps once forward also into that. How do we reuse what we have? So thank you for that.
It's important, yes. And again, that the effective aspect of that recognizing the reusability, its provenance is part of the publication process. So not seeing it as plagiarism or stealing or whatever, these emotive terms are used, but seeing reusability as a very worthy goal, but it has to be documented very much, the provenance in the metadata, the emphasis on the metadata as well. So it's a sort of comprehensive view of its history and its reuse going forward. So perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Maria Moraes, and hi, Fiona. Thank you for your comments. I totally agree with you. I had this kind of experience like Fiona. I went to Berkeley and I worked with Charles Forever, who was a pioneer, and I would emphasize also that some of these aspects are born from personal experiences. In fact, Charles Forever's wife was the vice director of IBM at some point, and they had things to do with wives, but they didn't know what to do with him when he visited in Chicago, the main center. So they decided to introduce him to technological things, and because he had worked in Wisconsin, he took up the idea. So I think serendipity sometimes plays a much more important role than we think. And I would like to stress some of the points that have already been made, and also about globality. My feeling, having worked in both sides of the Atlantic and also for a few years in England, is that in Europe, let's say the emphasis have been on preservation. So huge libraries, for instance, I think Spain is the country that has more manuscripts digitalized in Europeana. Perhaps because it's a poor country, that seems contradictory, but it was an easy way to preserve manuscripts. And on the other hand, in the United States, because there was not access to these materials, the focus was on using them and making them available for students. So I mean, the context also explains the different focuses. That said, I have to say that the fact that the United States has been pioneer, but mainly by medievalists, but by force, because the United States didn't exist in the Middle Ages, had to work with material which was not there on their desks, even if there are some manuscripts and some very nice American libraries. The financial support that through the NHS scholars in the United States have is much greater than in most European countries. And that makes a difference. And I'm going to give an example which is a little bit painful. But as you know, now there are big European projects granted by the European Research Council. They give up to €2,500,000 for 5 years, and they have produced very important and useful projects, like for instance, the Republic of Letters, which was initiated in Oxford, but now it's in Stanford, because Oxford, or the equivalent to the NHS in United Kingdom, doesn't have the means to support this project. So, for instance, I see some projects who were born in Europe, immigrating to the United States. I don't have anything against it, it's just a remark, okay? But I would like to see more collaboration, in the sense that there are projects like Perseus, which have done the other way around. It was born in California and now it's in Germany. So the recognition that this is a global aspect and we all benefit from it. I don't know, I know that this is not the forum, but I would like to make a call for our governments to collaborate more on these aspects, and perhaps allow European scholars to apply for NH grants to preserve some of these projects or enlarge them. And I don't know if you have heard of this, but now the European Union is planning to make a call of 5,000 million euros, so 5 billion in American terms, for cultural heritage, for the preservation and use of cultural heritage. And well, as Fiona has said, I think that we have also changed a little bit our mentality and think about how to reuse all this material, and stress the fact, they had talked some time ago, but on how most big projects, at least in Europe, are the result of the migration of traditional projects. Monumenta Germanica, for instance, I mean, that wouldn't be possible without the work of dozens of scholars in the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. All the documents about the Council of Constance, now they are in the 3 versions, and you can consult them on the web, and so on. So it's still this spirit or students, in the sense that it's valuable to use text, for instance, from the Historia de España, which is in the University of Birmingham, and recognize the sources, but at the same time feel free to use that material for other purposes. I think that is a key aspect for I would say, even for our survival, as Amelia has said, because if our students think, there's this wonderful thing, but they'll never be able to do something like that, and okay, is there this wonderful scholar and professor has done this thing, but I'm just a little small ant. How can I contribute to this? Or if I cannot use it, because some of the works are quite difficult to use, I must say, they are not user-friendly. I hope that in your next book you address this aspect too. And not all of them are open access, especially, I must say, in the United States. Now there's some very big projects which are not totally open access. In Europe, if you have public funds, they have to be open access. And our institutions here in Europe are not so rich. We cannot, we are paying now with Marisa to have a very simple web, and it's €2,000 a year. It seems not so much. My institutions, but I have a project, I can pay for it, but when the project stops, what I can do? Just take the raw data of this project that Fiona has mentioned, which is, Fiona, please do get it back. We need it.
We are certainly going to make available the data set, Maria. Have no fear. I would also, if I may, just add another point, if nobody else wishes to speak at this moment, that it's reusability, but also reproducibility is important. The more that we create results or analyses that provide quantitative data, the more important it is to make the data available for others to look at its reproducibility, to test the hypotheses. And to do that, you need the data. So that's another reason why all of this should be made available. Thank you.
Well, in science, we say that if you cannot iterate an experiment, and you have entitled the book Experiment and Innovation, if you cannot reiterate the experiment, it's not valid. N equals 1 is not science, what they say in science. And I think this is also a huge change of mentality in us, because we stress, as you said, the genius thinking and have this great idea that changes the view on something from this information. But if someone cannot correlate your conclusions, then it's a geniality that shows how intelligent you are, but perhaps it's not a big contribution to knowledge.
I think I would just like to, the question of precarity is an interesting one, because it seems like it's the old, everybody likes to think that when they were kids, they were walking uphill both ways to school and living on a nickel a day. And so I don't want to fall into that trap, but I do think that the question of precarity cuts both ways, because I think for a lot of American scholars look with some jealousy at their European colleagues because of a few things. One of them is the fact that as a medievalist anyway, studying the Middle Ages in the European context, you automatically have entree to questions like to issues like cultural heritage funding, because the Middle Ages is understood in the popular imagination, the political imagination, to have significance for the cultural heritage of your countries, because that's where you came from. Whereas in the United States, trying to talk about the Middle Ages often runs into the wall of presentism. No one can, it's very hard sometimes to make the case of why we should study this stuff that has nothing to do, as far as many people are concerned, with the history of our country. So there's that problem. We don't have the kinds of national and transnational funding mechanisms. We don't have an ECR, or European Research, or ERC. We don't have a European Research Council. We don't have EU funding. We don't have these national initiatives. I just look with longing upon what they did in Switzerland with the digitization of all the Swiss manuscripts through eCodicase, which is all done with government funding and with cantonal funding. You'd never do something like that in the US. The US political system and the US funding systems just don't lend themselves to these kinds of enterprises. I mean, I think on the other hand, though, and one of the things that comes out of this volume is, I think, for at least in North American, the development of a lot of these things was so entrepreneurial, exactly because there wasn't this emphasis as often as, I think this was mentioned by Fiona earlier, like this emphasis on super big projects that have you apply for a very large grant to build a very large team over a 5 or 10 year period to do this big thing. And then between that and then there's nothing. So there's either something really huge, or you do something that's just miserably funded and can't really continue. And in the US, there's very few very big funded projects in medieval studies. In fact, maybe none. There's a lot of projects being done on shoestrings and being done at a local level. And I think that ties together. I think that precarity and pedagogy, I think, go hand in hand with the digital medieval studies enterprise in the US, because so many of these things were done by people who needed something for a class they were teaching, or to serve their students, or to do something that wasn't they couldn't avail themselves of. And the case of the Internet Medieval Sourcebook, also the case of Dan Klein's project on Chaucer, both of them were generated by the fact that there was this huge racket of putting together course packets and forcing people to pay hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars for copyright permissions to put materials together for students. And they were looking for ways around it. So it was really kind of an entrepreneurial, how do we put stuff together? How do we solve this problem? It's sort of as we call it in America, the MacGyver approach, building something with chewing gum and some tape and a wire. But it meant that so precarity and pedagogy breed innovation, right? People have to do something. They don't have a lot of money to do it. They can't build a really big team. They have to figure out new things to do. The new things become their own models. And then perhaps they attract the attention of people who might give them some money. But it's just I don't think there's ever going to be a situation in which digital medieval studies, at least in North America, is going to be the target of large scale funding support. It just isn't going to be there. So I think one of the things that came out of this book and reading these projects is I think we just have to come to grips with it. If one thing isn't going to change, it's going to be precarity. pedagogy, we might shift our emphasis on pedagogy. We might shift in terms of how we collaborate, but the precarity for me is always going to be there. Sorry, Laura.
No, but certainly I think that also is one point of the book is for us to highlight the value of these projects. I think it's undeniable that when you have 83 million people popping in to check out the Middle Ages, right, that is something worth supporting. And what hasn't happened up till now is that, you know, even from our own field, it hasn't been recognized, you know, that some weight needs to be put behind these projects that are currently still on a shoestring. So if we're going to think about, you know, as we think about what our field does going forward, we need to recognize the value and we need to value it so that it won't disappear. So I think that's one part of what the book has accomplished or will accomplish, hopefully.
We will turn to Simona. We have Pompeu Fabra activated now, so we will skip the line.
No, yes, I didn't want really. I wanted to thank you both, Laura and Sean. Very nice to meet you again, Laura. Actually, so to take advantage of this for this personal note. And I wanted to thank very much Marisa and Marisa Blaskovic and Maria Morras too, and Maria Rio, who are you thanked me, Laura, before for organizing this, but in this case, it's really up to them the merit to make this possible. I wanted also to thank everybody to attend this and the contribution that have been made in this session of questions and answers. I was of course there were very so I also joined all the people that said how important it is to give any historical perspective to what we have been doing all these years, and it's impressive actually. It's really it's nice. It's a nice feeling to look backwards and see how much that's been done, and just in terms of you know being pioneers in a good sense. Yeah, there were several things to which or what you have said to which I was really sensitive. The thing about innovation, just to mention one. So you Sean mentioned the ERC here, and it's a. I mean, on the one hand, it's obviously a good opportunity, an extraordinary opportunity in terms of precarity. It gave me life for a few years. As some of you know, because I worked on two of those projects. But on the other hand, it's a little bit strange, especially from the point of view of imagining and creating new projects. In the sense that for a long while, I don't think it's anymore the case, or I hope it's not anymore the case. For a long time, basically, you had to add something digital in your project in order to hope to be funded. And I don't think it's the right way to go. It's a kind of tyranny on the innovation. Innovation has a form of tyranny. So you have to sell your merchandise, your thing, in order to persuade someone that what they are going to do is groundbreaking. And for a while, a few years ago, I mean, digital was kind of a synonymous of innovation. And this is also linked with the I mean, this joins what Fiona was mentioning about the importance of data sets and recommissioning and the top and the bottom up approach you were mentioning before. I mean, it's not so much why we should. So there is a question about why should we go digital in some projects and why not? No, what's the point of it? But if we could train our students from the very beginning on what a data set is, or what it means from all points of view. Quantitative, in processing procedures, in sorting out, in counting, in whatever, I mean, in digitizing, because these are all different processes, of course. But if we could train them from the very beginning on what it means, then the question wouldn't be, why should we go digital, but how should we go digital? How should we approach such and such a project? So anyway, this is it. I wanted to join you in thanking you and sharing the bit of this joy of having you here, at least virtually. Thanks.
It's great to see you, Simone. And I think your points are great in terms of, to tell you the truth, I think that we are beginning to sort of approach most of what we do digitally. I mean, whether we do it consciously and purposefully or not is another thing. But I think many of us approach our sources differently. I know that I do, right? That previously, if I had read a list of things, it would have been a boring kind of source. But now it's an exciting kind of source because I see the list of objects as, extractable items, entities, and not as just something, lacking narrative, right? Which is what we were, I think, cued into before. So I think these past 30 years have shifted us, sometimes imperceptibly. And that I think that it's going to find its way back into our training. Just because that's how we're all moving these days anyway. So thanks for your comments.
And I would also add that one thing that we alluded to, but I think is really important, and one of the reasons we focused on this inflection point of the rise of the internet, of the World Wide Web, and when you think about digital humanities and how that is a very different kind of digital humanities than BUSA or the work being done in the 70s, computational humanities, which I think is a different thing than I think when we talk about digital humanities today, I think about working on the internet. And I think you're right to say that there is, I think Fiona maybe brought this up, the idea that have a glitzy website seems to be what everybody wants to do, but that's of course not the point. I think what's really been key about the internet goes to that second point you raised, which is about partnership, because I think that the reason I think most of us approach our research in utterly different ways is because of the internet as a communication tool, as an integrative tool. So even if you're doing the most text-based analog kind of work, even if you're sitting in a room with a manuscript and transcribing it and doing all sorts of very hands-on kind of work, nonetheless, you have a network immediately accessible to you of colleagues and of resources that you can just draw upon at any moment. And I think just that sense of yourself being in a different kind of space as a researcher is really key. And I think that's, to me, in some ways, the most critical thing about, and I think that's one of the ways we have to think about being a digital humanist, is being in a digitally connected world. So that's always inflecting the work we do digitally, even if the work we do is, we're not making a website, we're not making a database, we're not doing any of those things. Nonetheless, we are digital humanists because that's who our community now is. We're working with people across the ocean, we're working with people around the world, we're sharing our work, we can share it with them in digital forms in ways that makes them able to see what we do quickly and availably. I mean, all of those of us who remember the days before all this existed, when you had to put it all in an envelope and mail it, so somebody could look at your photostatic reprints and mark them up and then send you a letter, or you on a phone call, right? There's no way to describe how different the experience is of doing scholarship. So I think that's another way to think about digital humanities, digital scholarship, is it's digital because we connect digitally.
Fiona raised her hand a while ago, and after that we can go to Amelia, if that's okay with everybody.
Okay, I will be brief. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate Sean's words, because the work that we did with this translation would not have been possible without having the resource of digital means to do it and the internet to collect to colleagues, because we need a very specific group of specialists and a very wide range of specialists as well, because of all the areas of a study that these chronicles touch. It's impossible to have them all in the same place. It's impossible to do it by mail. The internet put us all together and made it possible. And the other thing I would like to emphasize too, and which was mentioned here with the reusability, is that at a certain point when we began to develop this website in support and to be used to complete our work, we realized also that we wanted to make it as a point of support for other people that would like to do similar work, either do research in other areas of the Iberian medieval period, or do translation, but they can start already with the sort of glossary that we have started for them and continue increasing. And we are open for anyone to cooperate and collaborate with us. The other thing too is that when, as I said, this links with precarity. In the beginning, was very difficult to start when I started at UGA, and then our website was running the risk of dying because there was nobody else that would take over. And I reached the point when I was about to retire. I retired to Europe, and I was very lucky, and my colleagues feel very happy too, that I was able to transfer this site from the University of Georgia, of course, with their permission, to the University of Lisbon and the Institute of Medieval Studies. And that is that transferability that is useful. The other issue that we have, and then we still have got to think about it, is the platform, because platforms age. And sometimes to get the funds just to update the platform so that we carry on working and sustaining these databases or combined databases with, websites with a wider view is really, really hard. It's almost as hard as starting from the beginning. Thank you again.
Fiona?
Hello, thank you. Just to respond to 2 points that have been raised, one on space and the other on digitization. The question of space that Sean eloquently referred to was precisely a subject that was in the discussion an hour ago of the other digital humanities forum taking place at the University of London. And the question was whether digital humanities was a discipline or a methodology. And it was suggested that this was, in fact, a space for a multidisciplinary collaborative approach. And I think that's a valuable point that Sean has made about this space, this virtual space that we engage in. I would also add that it has led to new, if not posts, certainly professional definitions. I hear at Digital Humanities Conference, I hear people presenting themselves as a computational philologist or a digital medievalist. So the terminology is evolving as well. On the question of the wealth of primary sources, medieval sources across Europe compared to North America, certainly it's a physical fact, but the digitization of primary sources seems to be, at least from my perspective of experience of Great Britain and probably across the European Union archives, that there is money and there is an emphasis on what's referred to as the GLAM sector, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, I think. And some of it's political. There's money behind it to promote a public-facing visualization of their resources. And I think actually getting funding to work on these resources from a scholarly viewpoint is much more reduced, as Maria Moraes has alluded to. So there seems to be a distinction between digitization, making them visible, and as Laura has said, 83 million people have consulted medieval topic, and you see it in computer games and everywhere, isn't it? It's the medieval is a cultural phenomenon, and yet British universities are arguing that they don't really need a medievalist or even a Renaissance or a golden age in modern languages departments because students don't want that. They're not interested. So these posts are redundant. So this is just to make those comments to show that this is the tension that's going on in terms of medieval studies, that the digitization is increasing rapidly, and yet the funding, the support to be able to study the resources is reducing. Thank you.
This is something that Laura and I have discussed it, and I think I've heard this discussed in a lot of different fora, and a lot of people have raised it as the danger actually of viewing digitization as the goal, because what you're actually doing is creating a vast amount of material, and then you're not matching it with the development of an equal development of methodologies, approaches, and transformative sort of viewings of that material. So I don't know. I was trying to think of a comparable. It's sort of like if you cut down 1,000,000 trees, and then you just had them all stacked in the forest because no one had ever built a fireplace, or ever knew how to make furniture. I just feel like what we're doing is that we feel like the digitization, and then it's like, well, if we build it, like as they say in the movie Field of Dreams, if they build it, they will come. But I don't think we have to prepare people to come to it, and we have to make sure people understand how to use it effectively and responsibly. And this goes back to that issue of that students really need, as part of their education, they need to be learning. We talk about digital literacy in the United States, but that usually means how to recognize a scam on the internet. But it's much more than that. It's learning how to work. And I think that Simone's point was really well taken. It's not like, should there be a digital component to this? Well, of course there should. It's, well, what should it be? What is the responsible and sensible thing to do with the digital and with digital tools and affordances with the things we do? And it's not always, let's make a website. And it's not always, let's make a digital edition. It's not always, let's make a gallery. And it's not, there's lots of different things. And students need to understand what that all entails so that they can make sort of smart choices. And we as scholars need to do so as well. And I don't think we're there yet. There's some of that going on in American graduate education, but far too little.
And once again, back to the book, what we were able to see by getting these profiles is the moment of possibility that then was acted upon, right? None of the things that we all take for granted now necessarily had to be, right, the way that they are. They came about because of the decisions that were taken by all of these folks together. And I think, that's an important moment to reflect on, even as we go forward, right? Is that it's not because there's some sort of, magical pathway that it's necessarily going to take. It's based upon the decisions that they took and that we might take going forward as well.
Okay, well, looking at the time, maybe the last round, if somebody feels like I think we've touched up on many aspects, but let's see. If not, in the meantime, I would just like to thank you for hinting that there will be a third part, at least, hopefully. So looking forward to that. Also, to take the opportunity, because we're all here, we're going to do this seminar again later this year, not before October. So if if your work or somebody else's work, if they match our keywords, which is digital humanities and pre-modern textualities, very, very broadly defined, do let us know. We're a young center for DH, and we're still learning and growing. So are there any other questions or comments? Laura, Sean, do you have anything to add if maybe you felt like we haven't mentioned?
I just want to support you all in your work. It's really great. I think this is what, keeps us coming back is understanding that there's a community out there who believes in what we do and who values these methodologies and who sees that, what it gives us in terms of sharing our work more broadly. I think that's a very important component, even if that work is ephemeral, even if it only stays for a little while. There certainly is a community out there, and there certainly is an audience out there for our work. And I think sometimes we forget that. So I support what you're doing.
I'd also want to add that this book, I think, hopefully makes it clear how important it is to remember these stories and to tell these stories about the work you are all doing. And so record keeping, being good historians and being good stewards of the work you do and the decisions you make and the kinds of challenges you face, and documenting that and making sure that that is preserved as part of the work you do is, I think, really, really crucial. Because it's one of the worst things on earth is to do all this work and effort and then have it just disappear beneath the waves. and for other people then come along 5 years later and try to recreate the wheel that you so sensibly built. So the degree to which you can archive and support and protect, and this goes to the question of databases too, right? Keeping your database up to date, making sure that the formats are usable so that the projects you work on survive. Man, they may not, of course, they'll sunset. Everything does. All things meet their end. No website lasts forever, but the data you create and the questions you ask and the ideas you present, those are timeless, I think. So it's really important I encourage everyone to sort of take that on as part of their mission of being a digital humanist, is being a storyteller and a rememberer of the work you've done, and make sure that others can remember it too.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see it. Fiona she just added something which, yes, it's very important to include what didn't work. I can speak from personal experience. Every conference that I went to, people just show how great it is and all the features and what the tools, what they were able to do with different types of tools. And this is a very important aspect because there are many failures that are not documented before there is a success. And I think we should also teach our students that, because the frustration is there, but maybe the first small success is just behind it, around the corner. So thank you, Fiona, for bringing that up. That is very important. Well, I think that will be all. This is nice. 90 minutes, so just like a lecture. Thank you both. Thank everybody for coming, for joining us, for sharing your perspectives, which are unique but also understandable. The variety of the disciplines, frameworks, and also experience, and in the spirit of collaboration. I would just remind everybody that the MAA abstracts are due this week, if I'm not wrong, so that's very important. Let's not forget that.
Yes, and next Monday, they're due on Monday.
Okay.
Please submit your abstracts.
Better on Sunday, because of the time difference, but
well,
yeah. And thank you again. Thank you for sharing your insights. Looking forward to your volume, and let there be at least part 3 of the series.
Thank
you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.